The dust kicked up around Julia Johnson's worn boots as she walked through Fort Kearny's Main Street. Her head held high despite the whispers that followed her like shadows in the Nebraska sun of 1872. At 24 years old, she had been married to Thomas Johnson for 6 years, and in those 6 years, her womb had remained empty, a fact that the women of Fort Kearny discussed over their washing and their sewing with tongues sharper than any knife. Barren as the desert, Mrs. Patterson had said just yesterday, loud enough for Julia to hear as she passed the general store. What good is a wife who cannot give her husband sons? Julia had kept walking, her basket clutched tight against her chest, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She had learned long ago that responding only fed the fire, and there was already enough burning in her life. Thomas had grown cold over the years, his initial tenderness replaced by disappointment that settled into the lines of his face. He blamed her, of course. Everyone did. In a town where a woman's worth was measured by the children she bore, Julia was found wanting. The afternoon heat pressed down on the small Nebraska settlement as Julia made her way toward the edge of town, where the Johnson property sat. A modest house with land that Thomas worked with decreasing enthusiasm. He had taken to drinking more, working less, and spending his evenings at the saloon where other men would clap him on the shoulder and commiserate about his bad luck in marriage. She was halfway home when she heard the commotion near the livery stable. A crowd had gathered, and Julia's natural curiosity drew her closer despite her better judgment. People rarely welcomed her presence anymore, but she could see over the shoulders of the onlookers that a man was struggling with a horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that was rearing and kicking, its eyes wild with fear or pain. "That animal is mad," someone shouted. "Put it down before it kills someone." "No." The voice that responded was deep and steady, cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "He is not mad. He is hurt." Julia pushed forward, drawn by something in that voice, something that spoke of certainty and compassion in equal measure. She caught sight of the speaker then, a tall man in his late 20s with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that fell past his collar. He wore the clothes of a cowboy, dusty from travel, and he moved around the horse with a grace that suggested he understood the animal in ways others did not. "Step back," he said to the crowd, not looking at them, his attention fixed on the trembling horse. "You are frightening him more." "Who are you to tell us what to do?" Old Man Henderson demanded. "This is our town." "Ethan Kellerman," the cowboy replied simply, still not taking his eyes from the horse. "And this is a living creature in pain, which should be everyone's concern, regardless of whose town it is." Julia found herself moving closer, ignoring the disapproving looks from the other townspeople. She had always loved animals, had grown up on a ranch in Kansas before her marriage, and she could see what this Ethan Kellerman saw. The horse was favoring its right front leg, and there was a gash on its shoulder, probably from wire or a sharp branch. "He is cut," Julia said, her voice clear in the relative quiet that had fallen. "And his leg is injured. That is why he will not calm down." Ethan Kellerman turned then, and Julia found herself looking into eyes the color of summer sky, blue and clear and surprisingly kind. He studied her for a moment, and something passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that she saw what he saw. "You know horses," he said. "It was not a question. I grew up with them." He nodded once, then gestured toward the animal. "Will you help me? I need someone to speak to him gently while I examine the wounds. Everyone else seems determined to see him shot." Julia did not hesitate. She moved forward, aware of the gasps and murmurs from the crowd, aware that she was breaking another unspoken rule by putting herself forward, by offering help that had not been requested by her husband or any male authority. But she did not care. The horse needed help, and this stranger was asking for her assistance, seeing value in her when no one else in this town had for years. She approached the horse slowly, making soft sounds in her throat, the same sounds her father had taught her decades ago. The stallion's ears flicked toward her, and some of the wildness left his eyes. She reached out carefully, letting him smell her hand, then stroked his neck with gentle, sure movements. "That is right," she murmured. "No one here will hurt you. We only want to help." Ethan was already examining the leg, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Not broken," he said after a moment. "Badly bruised and swollen, but not broken. The cut is deeper. It will need cleaning and stitching." "I can do that," Julia heard herself say. "I have done it before for the animals on my father's ranch." Ethan looked at her again, and this time there was something like approval in his gaze, maybe even admiration. "I would be grateful for your help, Miss." "Mrs." someone in the crowd corrected sharply. "Mrs. Johnson." Though her husband should be ashamed, letting her make a spectacle of herself like this. Julia felt the familiar heat of shame creep up her neck, but before she could step back, before she could retreat into the small, careful space she had learned to occupy, Ethan spoke again. "Then Mr. Johnson is a fortunate man to have a wife with such skill and compassion." His voice was firm, brooking no argument, and he was still looking at Julia, not at the crowd. "Mrs. Johnson, if you are willing, I would appreciate your assistance. This horse has traveled far with me, and I would see him properly cared for." There was something in the way he said it, in the respect in his voice, that made Julia stand a little straighter. "I am willing," she said. The crowd dispersed gradually, disappointed perhaps that there would be no drama, no mad horse to be shot, no scandal to feed their gossip beyond what they already had. Julia was aware of Mrs. Patterson's disapproving glare, of the way Mr. Henderson shook his head as if she had confirmed every negative opinion he had ever held about her. But she focused on the horse, on the task at hand. Ethan led the stallion to the livery stable, Julia walking on the other side, her hand still on the animal's neck. The stable was cooler, shadowed and smelling of hay and leather, and the horse calmed further once inside. "I will need hot water," Julia said, falling into the familiar rhythm of care, "and clean cloth for bandages. The wound should be flushed thoroughly before stitching." "I have medical supplies in my saddlebag," Ethan said, "for animals and for people." A man learns to be prepared when he travels alone. He paused, then added, "I will get the water. Will you stay with him?" Julia nodded, and Ethan disappeared, leaving her alone with the horse. She continued to stroke its neck, examining the wounds more closely now. The cut was deep but clean, and the leg, as Ethan had said, was swollen but not broken. She had treated worse on her father's ranch, had learned from the ranch hands who had infinite patience for a curious girl with gentle hands and a quick mind. Those had been good years, before her mother had insisted she needed to marry, needed to find security and respectability. Thomas had seemed like a good choice then, a young man with his own land and prospects. But he had wanted a brood mare, not a wife, and when she had failed to provide the children he expected, he had withdrawn his affection as if it had never existed. "You have sad eyes," Ethan said, returning with a bucket of steaming water and several cloths. "I noticed it earlier when you first spoke." Julia was startled by his directness. People in Fort Kearny spoke about her, but not to her, and certainly not with such frank observation. "I am fine," she said automatically. Fine is what people say when they are not fine, but do not wish to be questioned further. Ethan set down the bucket and pulled his medical kit from his saddlebag, a worn leather case that opened to reveal needles and thread, bottles of disinfectant, and various other supplies. But you do not owe me your troubles. You owe me only your skill with this horse, and I am already grateful for that. They worked together in companionable silence, Julia cleaning the wound with careful attention while Ethan held the horse steady and prepared the needle and thread. The stallion flinched but did not fight, as if he understood they were helping him. When the wound was clean, Julia threaded the curved needle with practiced ease and began to stitch, her stitches small, and even the way her father's foreman had taught her. "You have done this many times," Ethan observed, watching her work. "My father raised horses and cattle in Kansas. I spent more time in the stables than in the house, much to my mother's dismay." Julia tied off another stitch. "She said it was unladylike, that I should be learning to cook and sew and prepare for marriage." "You did learn to sew," Ethan said, and there was a hint of humor in his voice. "Just not on cloth." Julia surprised herself by almost smiling. It had been so long since anyone had joked with her, had treated her as if she were a person worth talking to rather than a disappointment to be endured. "I can sew cloth too," she said, "and cook, and keep a house. I learned all the things a proper wife should know. But you preferred the horses." "I preferred the horses," she admitted. "They do not judge. They do not measure your worth by things you cannot control." Ethan was quiet for a moment, and when Julia glanced up from her work, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "The people in this town are harsh," he said finally. "I heard what that woman said before, about you being barren." Julia's hand stilled on the needle. She had not realized he had heard that, had hoped perhaps he had arrived after that particular piece of cruelty. "It is true," she said, keeping her voice level. "I have been married 6 years and have no children. In a place like this, that makes me less than worthless." "It makes you unlucky," Ethan corrected. "Or perhaps it makes your husband unlucky, if he cannot see the value in a woman who would wade into a crowd to help a frightened animal, who has the skill to heal and the courage to use it." Julia looked at him fully then, the needle forgotten in her hand. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," Ethan said. "I know you did not hesitate when I asked for help, even though you knew it would bring you judgment. I know you have gentle hands and a good heart. I know those things matter more than the number of children a woman bears, though I seem to be in the minority in that opinion." "You are in the minority," Julia said softly. "Even my husband believes I have failed him." "Then your husband is a fool." The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their bluntness and somehow liberating in their honesty. Julia found herself blinking back tears, not of sadness but of something else, something that felt almost like relief. To have someone, even a stranger, see her as something other than a failure was a gift she had not known she needed. She finished the stitching in silence, bandaged the wound with strips of clean cloth, and then turned her attention to the swollen leg. Ethan had a liniment in his kit, and she rubbed it into the horse's leg with firm, gentle pressure, feeling the heat of the inflammation beneath her fingers. "He should rest for several days," she said when she was finished. "The swelling should go down if he stays off the leg. The stitches should stay in for 2 weeks, then can be removed." "Will you help me with that?" Ethan asked. "The removing of the stitches, I mean. I will be in Fort Kearny for a time. I am looking for work, and I heard there were ranches nearby in need of experienced hands." Julia hesitated. She should say no. She should walk away now, return to her house and her cold husband and her small, joyless life. Spending more time with this stranger, this cowboy with kind eyes and careful words, was dangerous. Not because he posed any physical threat, but because he made her remember what it felt like to be seen, to be valued, and that remembering could only lead to more pain when she had to return to reality. But she found herself nodding. "Yes," she said, "I will help you." Ethan's smile was warm and genuine, reaching his eyes and transforming his entire face. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. You have been a blessing today to me and to this horse. A blessing." Julia turned the word over in her mind as she walked home later, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the Nebraska sky in shades of orange and gold. When was the last time someone had called her a blessing? When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen anything other than her failures? Thomas was not home when she arrived, which was both a relief and a source of anxiety. It meant he was at the saloon, drinking away money they could not afford to waste, but it also meant she did not have to explain where she had been or why she was late preparing supper. She went through the motions of cooking, her mind elsewhere, replaying the afternoon in the livery stable, the feel of working beside someone who respected her skills, the sound of being called a blessing. When Thomas finally stumbled home well after dark, he was drunk and belligerent, smelling of whiskey and tobacco. He looked at the plate of food Julia had kept warm for him and shoved it aside. "Cold," he muttered. "Everything you do is cold." Julia said nothing. She had learned that silence was safer than defense when he was in this state. "Heard you made a fool of yourself today," Thomas continued, dropping into his chair with little grace. "Playing with horses like some kind of man. Mrs. Patterson said you were practically throwing yourself at some drifter." "I was helping with an injured animal," Julia said quietly. "Nothing more." "You do not help with anything that matters," Thomas shot back. 6 years, Julia. 6 years, and you have given me nothing. My mother was right. I should have married Mary Thornton. She has 4 children now. 4. The words were not new, but they still cut, still found the tender places inside her that had not yet scarred over. Julia gathered the dishes and took them to the basin, her movements mechanical. "I am going to bed," Thomas announced, pushing himself up from the chair. "Alone, as usual. What is the point otherwise?" Julia waited until she heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs. Waited until the sound of the bed frame creaking told her he had collapsed onto the mattress, before she allowed herself to sink into the chair he had vacated. She put her head in her hands and breathed slowly, counting the breaths the way she had taught herself to do, a method of holding herself together when everything felt like it was falling apart. She thought of Ethan Kellerman, of his quiet strength and unexpected kindness. She thought of how he had defended her to the crowd, how he had called her husband fortunate, how he had looked at her as if she mattered. It was dangerous to think of him, dangerous to hold onto those moments like precious stones, but she could not help herself. In the darkness of her kitchen, with her drunk husband snoring upstairs and the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her shoulders, that memory was the only light she had. The next morning, Thomas was gone before Julia woke, and she knew he had left early to avoid her, to avoid the cold silence that had become their marriage. She went about her chores with the efficiency of long practice, cleaning the house that never seemed to get dirty because no children ran through it with muddy feet and sticky hands, mending clothes that had no urgent holes because there were no little ones to tear them climbing trees or chasing adventures. She was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard a horse approaching. Her heart gave a small, traitorous leap, but when she turned, it was not Ethan. It was Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson, the 2 pillars of Fort Kearney society and the 2 women most dedicated to making Julia's life miserable. "Good morning," Julia said, because manners were armor and she had learned to wear them well. "We have come to speak with you," Mrs. Patterson announced, not bothering to dismount from her wagon. "About your behavior yesterday." "My behavior?" Julia kept her voice neutral. "Cavorting with a strange man in the livery stable," Mrs. Henderson said, her thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval. Without your husband present, without any proper chaperone. It is shameful, Julia. Absolutely shameful. I was helping with an injured horse, Julia said. The same explanation she had given Thomas, though she knew it would be equally ineffective here. You were making a spectacle of yourself, Mrs. Patterson corrected. You may have no reputation left to lose, given your situation, but the rest of us have standards to maintain. This town has standards to maintain. We cannot have women running around acting like men, putting themselves forward in such an unseemly manner. That cowboy asked for my help, Julia said, feeling a spark of defiance kindle in her chest. The horse was in pain. Would you have had me refuse? We would have had you remember your place, Mrs. Henderson said sharply. You are a married woman, though you have failed to fulfill the most basic duty of that role. The least you can do is behave with proper decorum. We are here to warn you, Mrs. Patterson added. That man, that Ethan Kellerman, has taken work at the Sullivan Ranch. He will be in Fort Kearny for some time. You are to stay away from him. You are not to speak to him, not to acknowledge him. You have caused enough gossip, and we will not have you dragging this town's good name through the mud with your shameless behavior. Julia felt her defiance flare hotter. These women, who had made her life a misery for years, who measured her worth in children and found her lacking, who whispered about her in church and excluded her from their gatherings, now presumed to tell her who she could speak to. I will speak to whomever I choose, Julia said, her voice steady despite the anger thrumming through her veins. And I will help anyone who asks, human or animal, regardless of what you or anyone else in this town thinks about it. Mrs. Patterson's face flushed an unbecoming shade of red. Your husband will hear of this insolence. My husband already knows I helped with the horse yesterday, Julia replied. And if he objects to my speaking to you this way, he is welcome to discuss it with me himself, rather than sending the town gossips to do his work. Mrs. Henderson gasped as if Julia had struck her, and Mrs. Patterson looked like she might combust from outrage. You will regret this, she said, her voice tight. Mark my words, Julia Johnson, you will regret this. They left in a flurry of dust and righteous indignation, and Julia stood in her yard, her heart pounding, her hands shaking slightly. She had never spoken to them that way before, had never dared to voice the anger and resentment that had been building for years. But something had shifted yesterday in the livery stable, something fundamental in how she saw herself, and she found she could not go back to being the meek, apologetic woman who absorbed their cruelty without response. She finished hanging the laundry and went inside to start bread, her mind churning. She knew there would be consequences for her words, knew that Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson would spread their version of the encounter all over town. Thomas would hear of it, and he would be angry, but Julia found she could not summon the energy to care as much as she should. The bread was rising when she heard another horse, and this time when she looked out the window, her heart's leap was justified. Ethan Kellerman sat astride a different horse, a sturdy bay, and he was leading his chestnut stallion, the one they had treated together. The horse was walking better, she noted with satisfaction, still favoring the legs slightly but not in obvious pain. Julia wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, very aware that she was defying Mrs. Patterson's orders within hours of receiving them, and feeling a small thrill of rebellion at doing so. Mr. Kellerman, she said in greeting. Mrs. Johnson. He touched the brim of his hat. I hope I am not intruding. I wanted to show you that Thunder is doing better thanks to your help. Thunder. Julia moved closer, reaching out to stroke the stallion's nose. That is his name. It suits him, I think. He came to me during a thunderstorm 3 years ago. Lost and frightened and half wild, we have been together ever since. Ethan dismounted, and Julia noticed he moved with a slight limp, as if he too had old injuries that pained him. "The swelling in his leg is already going down. Your liniment worked well." "I am glad," Julia said, and meant it. The horse nuzzled her hand, and she felt that same sense of peace she always felt around animals, that uncomplicated acceptance that humans so rarely offered. "I heard I caused you trouble," Ethan said, his voice quiet. "I started work at the Sullivan Ranch this morning, and the other hands were full of stories about the scandal at the livery stable yesterday. They said the town is talking about you, about us." Julia felt heat creep into her cheeks. "The town always talks about me," she said. "Yesterday simply gave them new material. I am sorry for that. I did not mean to make your life more difficult." "You did not make it more difficult," Julia said firmly. "You treated me with respect and kindness. If the town chooses to see scandal in that, it is their failing, not yours." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and Julia had the sense he was seeing past the surface, past the careful walls she had built around herself. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone more beaten down, perhaps. Someone who had accepted what the world told them they were." He paused. "But you have fire in you still, I can see it." "I am not sure if that is a compliment or a warning," Julia said, but she was smiling slightly, unable to help herself. "It is an observation," Ethan said, "and an admiration. Fire is precious. It should not be extinguished." They stood there in her yard, the morning sun climbing higher, and Julia knew she should send him away, knew that every moment he stayed was another piece of ammunition for the gossips. But she found she did not want him to leave, found that she was starved for this, for conversation that treated her as an equal, for the presence of someone who did not view her as a failure. "Would you like some water?" she asked, knowing it was a risk, knowing she was inviting more trouble. "For yourself and the horses." "That would be kind," Ethan said. Julia drew water from the well, filling a bucket for the horses and pouring a cup for Ethan. He drank gratefully, and she found herself studying him in the daylight, noting the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work, the quiet strength in the way he carried himself. "The Sullivan Ranch is a good place," she said, more to fill the silence than because she had anything particular to say about it. "Mr. Sullivan is fair, from what I have heard." "He seems so," Ethan agreed. "He hired me on the spot when I told him my experience. I have worked ranches in Texas, Colorado, and Montana. I know cattle and horses, and I am not afraid of hard work." "Why Fort Kearny?" Julia asked. "It is not a large town. There are bigger ranches, better opportunities elsewhere." Ethan was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I have been to the big places, the famous towns. I have worked the famous ranches, but I am tired of moving, tired of never settling. I am looking for somewhere to call home, somewhere that feels right. I do not know if Fort Kearny is that place, but I am willing to stay long enough to find out. Home." Julia rolled the word around in her mind. Fort Kearny had never felt like home to her, despite 6 years of trying. It had always felt like a prison, beautiful perhaps in the way the prairie could be beautiful, but confining nonetheless. "I hope you find what you are looking for," she said quietly. "I think perhaps I already have," Ethan said, and his eyes were on her face when he said it, warm and intent. Julia's breath caught. She should discourage this, should step back and create distance. She was a married woman, and he was a cowboy just passing through, and nothing good could come from the connection she felt forming between them. But she had been so lonely for so long, and he was looking at her like she mattered, and she could not bring herself to turn away. "I should go," Ethan said, though he made no move to mount his horse. "I have work to return to, but I wonder, the stitches in Thunder's shoulder." You said they should be removed in 2 weeks. Yes, Julia said. Would you be willing to do that? I trust your skill more than my own in such matters. It was an excuse, and they both knew it. Ethan was clearly capable of removing stitches himself. But it was also an invitation, a promise of seeing each other again, and Julia found herself nodding before she could think better of it. Yes, she said. I will help with that. 2 weeks, then, Ethan said. He mounted his bay with easy grace, gathering Thunder's lead rope. Thank you for the water, Mrs. Johnson, and for the company. You are welcome, Mr. Kellerman. He rode away, and Julia stood in her yard watching him go, the sun warm on her shoulders, her heart doing strange, dangerous things in her chest. She knew she was playing with fire, knew that allowing herself to care about this man, to look forward to seeing him again, was foolish beyond measure. But she had spent 6 years being careful, being good, swallowing her pain and accepting her lot, and where had it gotten her? She was still alone, still judged, still miserable. Maybe foolishness was what she needed. Maybe fire was exactly what her life had been lacking. The 2 weeks that followed were both the longest and the shortest of Julia's life. Thomas grew more distant and more hostile, his evenings at the saloon stretching later, his words when he was home growing sharper. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson made good on their threat, spreading stories about Julia's impropriety, until the entire town seemed to be whispering about her whenever she appeared in public. She was refused service at the general store, turned away from church by the minister's wife, who suggested she should focus on mending her marriage before seeking spiritual guidance. Julia endured it all with a stolid determination, but inside she felt something cracking, the careful shell she had built around herself to survive splintering under the relentless assault. She found herself thinking of Ethan constantly, wondering what he was doing at the Sullivan Ranch, wondering if he thought of her, wondering what it would be like to have a life where she was free to explore these feelings that had taken root in her heart. She saw him twice during those 2 weeks, both times from a distance. Once when she was walking to the general store before she knew she would be refused entry, and once when she was at the edge of town gathering wildflowers, a small rebellion against the ugliness of her life. Both times he had been riding with other Sullivan Ranch hands, and both times their eyes had met across the distance, a connection that made Julia's heart race and her breath catch. On the 14th day after they had stitched Thunder's wounds, Julia woke to find Thomas packing a bag. I am going to Lincoln, he announced without preamble. There is a cattle auction, and I need to see about buying stock. We do not have money for cattle, Julia said carefully. We would have money if I had a proper wife, Thomas shot back. But since I do not, I have to make do with what I have. I will be gone 3 days, maybe 4. Try not to embarrass me further while I am away. He left without saying goodbye, without giving her money for food or supplies, without any of the small courtesies that even the worst husbands usually observed. Julia watched him go and felt nothing but relief. 3 days, maybe 4. 3 days of not walking on eggshells, of not measuring every word, of not enduring his cold disappointment. 3 days of freedom. She waited until noon, until she was certain Thomas would be well on his way to Lincoln, before she changed into her best dress, the blue one that brought out her eyes, and walked into town. The Sullivan Ranch was about 2 miles past Fort Kearny's Main Street, and Julia set out with determination, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her progress. The ranch was impressive, sprawling acres of grassland dotted with cattle, and several buildings including a large barn and a bunkhouse. Julia asked the first ranch hand she saw where she might find Ethan Kellerman, and the man pointed toward the corral where several horses were being worked. Ethan was there, sitting on the fence rail and watching a younger cowboy attempt to break a spirited mare. He saw Julia approaching, and his face lit up in a way that made her feel warm from the inside out. He hopped down from the fence and met her halfway, pulling off his hat in greeting. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, and his smile was genuine and delighted. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "You said 2 weeks for the stitches," Julia said, suddenly shy now that she was here, now that she had taken this bold step. "It has been 2 weeks." "So it has," Ethan agreed. "Thunder is in the barn. Shall we?" They walked together to the barn, not touching but close enough that Julia was aware of every breath he took, every movement he made. The barn was dim and cool, smelling of hay and horses, and Thunder whinnied in greeting when he saw Ethan. "He has healed well," Julia said, examining the horse's shoulder. The wound had closed cleanly, the stitches holding perfectly. "You have taken good care of him." "I have had good instruction," Ethan said. Julia worked carefully, removing each stitch with steady hands, applying a salve to the newly healed skin. Thunder stood patiently, and Ethan watched her work with an expression that made Julia's hands want to tremble. When she was finished, she stepped back and found herself standing very close to Ethan in the narrow confines of the stall. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she knew she should move away, should put distance between them, but she could not make herself do it. "Julia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I should not say this. I have no right to say this. But these 2 weeks have been torture, seeing you from a distance and not being able to speak to you, knowing you were suffering because of me." "Not because of you," Julia said softly. "I was suffering long before you arrived in Fort Kearney." "Your husband is a fool," Ethan said, echoing his words from 2 weeks ago. "You are extraordinary and he cannot see it." "You do not know me," Julia protested weakly. "We have spent perhaps 2 hours in each other's company." "I know enough," Ethan said. "I know you are brave and skilled and compassionate. I know you have been beaten down by people who should have lifted you up. I know that when I look at you, I see everything I have been searching for without knowing I was searching." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was rough with emotion. "I know I am falling in love with you, and I know it is wrong, and I know I should leave Fort Kearney before I cause you more pain. But I also know I do not want to go." Julia's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of something so overwhelming she had no name for it. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw honesty, such vulnerable truth. Thomas had courted her with pretty words that meant nothing, had promised her happiness and security, and had delivered neither. But Ethan, who owed her nothing, who had every reason to protect himself, was standing here offering her his heart with no guarantee that she would not break it. "I am married," she whispered, the only defense she had left. "I know," Ethan said. "And if you love your husband, if there is any hope for your marriage, I will leave tomorrow and you will never see me again. I will not be the cause of breaking a happy union." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with infinite gentleness. "But if you do not love him, if you are as alone in your marriage as I suspect you are, then I am asking you to consider something different. Consider a life where you are valued. Consider a life where you are loved. Consider me." Julia closed her eyes, feeling the tears spill over and track down her cheeks. She thought of Thomas, of the cold, bitter man who blamed her for his disappointments and sought solace in whiskey and the company of anyone but his wife. She thought of the vows she had spoken 6 years ago, promises made before God and witnesses. She thought of the woman she had been then, young and hopeful and believing in love, and she thought of the woman she was now, worn down and judged and so tired of being alone. She thought of Ethan's kindness, his respect, the way he saw her not as a failure but as a blessing. She thought of what he was offering, not just love but partnership, not just romance but recognition of her worth. "I do not love him," she said, opening her eyes and meeting Ethan's gaze. "I did once, or thought I did, but he killed whatever affection I had with his coldness and his blame. I have stayed because I had nowhere else to go, no other options, but I do not love him. I have not loved him for years." "Then leave him," Ethan said simply. "Come with me. We will go somewhere new, somewhere no one knows us or cares about the scandal. We will start fresh." "It is not that simple," Julia said, though her heart was screaming that yes, it could be exactly that simple. "I am his wife. The law says I am his property. If I leave, he can force me to return. And if you and I, if we are together, he could have me arrested for adultery, for kidnapping, for any number of crimes." Ethan nodded. "I know the law. I also know it is unjust. But Julia, I am willing to risk it if you are. I am willing to fight for you, to fight for us, if you will just give us a chance." Julia realized she was shaking. This was too much, too fast, too overwhelming. But it was also everything she wanted, everything she had stopped letting herself dream about. A chance at happiness. A chance at love. A chance at a life where she mattered. "He is in Lincoln," she heard herself say, "for 3 days, maybe 4. Understanding flashed in Ethan's eyes. "3 days is enough," he said. "Enough to ride to Wyoming, to get married once you have legally separated. Enough to disappear before he can follow." "People will say terrible things about me," Julia said. "Worse things than they already say." "Let them," Ethan said fiercely. "They do not matter. Only you matter. Only we matter." Julia took a shaky breath. She was standing at a crossroads, and she knew that whatever choice she made now would determine the rest of her life. She could turn away, return to her house and her cold marriage and her small, suffocating existence. She could be safe and miserable and proper, or she could choose herself. She could choose love. She could choose Ethan. "I will need to pack some things," she said, and heard the decision in her own voice, firm despite her trembling. "And I should leave a letter for Thomas, explaining. I will not have him thinking I was kidnapped or murdered." "Pack only what you can carry," Ethan said. "We will travel light and fast. I have some money saved, enough to get us started somewhere new. We will figure the rest out as we go." They left the barn together, and Julia felt like she was walking through a dream. Ethan saddled Thunder and his bay, and Julia accepted his help in mounting the stallion, settling into the saddle with an ease that came from her childhood years of riding. The horse shifted beneath her, and she laid a hand on his neck, feeling his warmth and strength. "I need to go to my house," she told Ethan, "to pack and to write the letter. Will you come with me?" "Anywhere," Ethan said simply. They rode to Julia's house together, no longer caring who saw them or what conclusions might be drawn. Julia's heart was pounding with equal parts fear and exhilaration as they reached the small property. Inside, everything looked the same, but Julia felt fundamentally different, as if she had shed a skin and emerged new. She packed quickly and efficiently, taking only her most practical clothes, a few precious items that had belonged to her mother, and all the money she had managed to hide away over the years from her household budget. It was not much, but it was hers, and she would not leave it for Thomas to drink away. She wrote the letter with careful words, explaining that she was leaving, that she wanted a separation, and eventually, a divorce if such a thing could be arranged. She did not mention Ethan by name, but she did not hide her feelings either. "I deserve to be happy," she wrote at the end. "I deserve to be loved. I am sorry I could not be what you wanted, but I cannot stay and be nothing any more. I hope you find what you need, Thomas. I am going to find what I need." She left the letter on the kitchen table, weighed down with Thomas's coffee cup, and walked out of the house without looking back. Ethan was waiting with the horses, and he helped her secure her bag to Thunder's saddle. Then he mounted his bay and looked at her with such tenderness that Julia felt her eyes sting with tears again. "Are you ready?" he asked. Julia looked at the house one more time, at the prison that had held her for 6 years. She thought of all the tears she had cried within those walls, all the loneliness she had endured, all the small deaths her spirit had suffered. And then she turned to Ethan, to this man who had called her a blessing, who had seen her worth when no one else could, who was offering her a chance at a new life. "I am ready," she said. They rode out of Fort Kearny as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the Nebraska sky in shades of gold and pink. Julia did not look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the open prairie stretching endlessly before them, on the promise of freedom and love, and a future she could not yet imagine but desperately wanted to discover. They rode hard and fast, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Fort Kearny before darkness fell. Ethan knew the land well, guiding them along paths that kept them away from main roads and towns, places where they might be recognized or remembered. They stopped only when the light had faded so much that continuing was dangerous, making camp in a small copse of trees near a creek. Ethan built a fire while Julia tended to the horses, falling into an easy partnership that felt natural despite the newness of their situation. They ate a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack from Ethan's supplies and then sat together by the fire, the night vast and star-filled around them. "Are you afraid?" Ethan asked quietly. Julia considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted. "I am terrified. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, or how we will manage, or if we will be caught. But I am also more alive than I have felt in years. So perhaps fear is not such a bad thing if it comes with feeling." Ethan reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused and strong. "I will take care of you," he said. "I promise you that. Whatever comes, we will face it together." "I am not used to together," Julia said. "I am used to alone even when someone else was in the room." "Then you will have to get used to something new," Ethan said, and he raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a reverence that made Julia's heart stutter. "Because I am not going anywhere. You are stuck with me now." Julia laughed, a genuine sound of joy that surprised her with its lightness. "I think I can live with that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, the creek murmuring nearby. Julia felt the tension of the day beginning to ease from her shoulders, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Ethan must have noticed because he stood and spread out his bedroll. "You should sleep," he said. "We have a long ride tomorrow." "Where will you sleep?" Julia asked. "On the other side of the fire," Ethan said firmly. "You are still legally married, and I will not compromise your honor more than I already have. When we reach Wyoming, when we can make this right and legal, then things will be different. But for now, I will be a gentleman." Julia wanted to protest that it was foolish, that they had already crossed so many lines that this one seemed arbitrary. But she also appreciated his respect, his determination to do right by her, even in circumstances that were far from right. She settled into the bedroll, still wearing her dress, and watched Ethan spread his own blankets on the opposite side of the fire. "Good night, Julia," he said softly. "Good night, Ethan." She fell asleep to the sound of the fire and the creek and Ethan's steady breathing. And for the first time in years, she felt safe. They woke at dawn and were riding again within an hour, continuing their journey west and north toward Wyoming. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, the flat Nebraska prairie giving way to rolling hills, and then to the more rugged terrain of Wyoming territory. They passed through small settlements where no one knew them, stopping only to buy supplies and to rest the horses. On the third day, they reached a small town called Pine Ridge, nestled in a valley with the mountains rising blue in the distance. Ethan made inquiries and learned that there was a lawyer in town who could help Julia file for legal separation from Thomas, the first step toward an eventual divorce. The lawyer, a middle-aged man named Mr. Blackwell, listened to Julia's story with a sympathetic ear. He explained that divorce was difficult but not impossible, especially given Thomas's treatment of her, his drinking, and the fact that Julia had finally left. "It will take time," Mr. Blackwell cautioned. "Months, possibly a year or more, but if you are determined, it can be done. In the meantime, you can file for legal separation, which will give you some protection and independence." Julia signed the papers with a hand that was surprisingly steady. She was doing this. She was actually doing this. She was severing the ties that had bound her to a life of misery and choosing something different, something better. When they left the lawyer's office, Ethan took her hand as they walked down the main street of Pine Ridge. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. He was claiming her publicly, announcing to anyone who cared to notice that they were together that she was under his protection and affection. "What now?" Julia asked. "Now we find somewhere to stay while we figure out our next steps," Ethan said. "I can find work easily enough. I am good with horses and cattle, and ranches always need experienced hands. You could find work too if you wanted. There is a boarding house at the edge of town. The woman who runs it seemed kind when I asked directions earlier." The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Harriet Fletcher, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She looked at Julia and Ethan standing on her porch and seemed to read the entire situation in a glance. "We need 2 rooms," Ethan said firmly. "The lady and I are not married, and I will not have anyone suggesting otherwise until we can make it legal." Mrs. Fletcher's stern expression softened slightly. "The lady can tell me her own story if she chooses," she said, turning to Julia. "I do not judge easily, having made my own share of mistakes in life, but I will not rent rooms to people who bring trouble to my door." Julia met the older woman's eyes directly. "My name is Julia Johnson. I was married to a cruel man who blamed me for not giving him children and who drank away our money and happiness. I have left him and filed for separation with the intention of seeking a divorce. This man, Ethan Kellerman, helped me escape, and I love him. We are trying to do things properly, but we need time and space to make our lives right. We will not bring trouble to your door intentionally, but I understand if our situation makes you uncomfortable." Mrs. Fletcher studied Julia for a long moment, and then nodded slowly. "I had a sister once," she said quietly. "Her husband was cruel too. She stayed because she thought she had no choice, and he killed her eventually with his fists and his anger. I swore after that I would never judge a woman for leaving a bad situation." She stepped back, opening the door wider. "I have 2 rooms available. The rent is reasonable and I provide breakfast and dinner. You will work for your keep, both of you. I can always use help around the place." Relief flooded through Julia so powerfully she felt lightheaded. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you so much." "Do not thank me yet," Mrs. Fletcher said, but there was a hint of warmth in her voice. "You will earn every bit of my hospitality, but you will be safe here and respected. That I can promise you." The rooms were small but clean, and Julia's was next to Ethan's, separated by a thin wall through which she could hear him moving about. It was strange and wonderful to have her own space, a place that was hers alone, where no one would criticize or blame her. They settled into a routine over the following weeks. Ethan found work at a nearby ranch, similar to his job at the Sullivan place, and he brought his wages home to Mrs. Fletcher to pay their rent and expenses. Julia helped Mrs. Fletcher with the boarding house, cooking and cleaning and tending to the small garden behind the property. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and Julia found satisfaction in it that she had never found in keeping house for Thomas. In the evenings after dinner, she and Ethan would sit on the porch of the boarding house and talk. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and hopes and fears. Ethan told her about his childhood in Colorado, the son of a rancher who had taught him everything about horses and cattle, before dying when Ethan was 18. He told her about the years of drifting, working one ranch after another, always searching for something he could not name until he met her. Julia told him about her father's ranch in Kansas, about the joy she had felt working with the animals, about her mother's insistence that she needed to marry well and be respectable. She told him about Thomas's courtship, which had seemed genuine at the time, and the slow deterioration of their marriage as year after childless year passed. "I tried everything," she confessed one evening as they watched the sun set behind the mountains. "Every folk remedy, every prayer. I saw a doctor once in secret, using money I had saved from the household funds. He told me there was nothing wrong with me that he could see, that sometimes these things just happened, that perhaps the problem lay with Thomas. But when I tried to tell Thomas that, he became furious. He said I was trying to blame him for my failings. The problem was never yours," Ethan said firmly. "And even if you could never have children, it would not make you less valuable, less worthy of love." "You say that now," Julia said quietly. "But what if we marry and I cannot give you children either? What if the problem truly is with me?" Ethan turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Julia, listen to me. I want you. Not your womb, not your ability to bear children. You, the woman who risked judgment to help a frightened horse. The woman who left everything she knew to chase happiness. The woman who is brave and kind and stronger than anyone I have ever met. If we have children, that will be a blessing. If we do not, you will still be my greatest blessing. You understand?" Julia felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I have never been anyone's blessing before," she whispered. "Then they were all fools," Ethan said. "And I am grateful for their foolishness because it meant you were still here when I found you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Julia felt something inside her that had been broken for years finally begin to mend. Months passed, and Pine Ridge became home in a way Fort Kearny had never been. Julia made friends with the other women in town, women who saw her as a person rather than a failure. Mrs. Fletcher became almost like a mother to her, teaching her skills Julia had never learned from her own mother, offering advice and comfort in equal measure. The legal proceedings crawled forward at a frustratingly slow pace, but Mr. Blackwell assured Julia that they were making progress. Thomas had been served with the separation papers, and he had contested them, as expected, but he had no real grounds to force Julia back. She had witnesses to his drinking, to his verbal cruelty, and the law, while still heavily favored toward men, was beginning to recognize that women had some rights in matters of extreme mistreatment. Ethan proved himself to be everything he had promised and more. He was patient with the slow progress toward marriage, respectful of Julia's healing process, and unfailingly supportive. He brought her wildflowers he found on his rides, helped her in Mrs. Fletcher's garden, and held her when the nightmares came, the ones where she was back in Fort Kearny being judged and condemned and found wanting. 1 year after they had fled Nebraska, Mr. Blackwell called them into his office with news. The divorce had been granted. Thomas had finally given up fighting, perhaps because he had realized that Julia was not coming back, perhaps because he had found some other woman to blame for his failures. Whatever the reason, Julia was free. She walked out of that office and into the bright Wyoming sunshine feeling like she had been reborn. Ethan was waiting for her on the street, and when he saw her face, he knew. "It is done," he asked. "It is done," Julia confirmed. "I am free." Ethan let out a whoop of joy that turned heads all down the street, and then he picked Julia up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears and happiness. "Marry me," he said. "Right now, today." "I do not want to wait another moment." Julia did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married that afternoon by the local minister, with Mrs. Fletcher and Mr. Blackwell standing as witnesses. Julia wore a simple dress of pale yellow that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her sew, and Ethan wore his best clothes, his hair slicked back and his face shining with happiness. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed Julia with a tenderness that made her forget that anyone else existed in the world. Mrs. Fletcher hosted a small celebration dinner at the boarding house, inviting the friends Julia and Ethan had made in Pine Ridge. It was nothing like the grand wedding Julia had had with Thomas, the one her mother had insisted on with all the proper trappings and expensive details. But it was perfect because it was real, because it was full of people who genuinely cared about them, because it was the beginning of the life Julia had chosen rather than the one that had been chosen for her. That night, Ethan carried Julia over the threshold of their new home, a small cabin they had rented on the outskirts of town, planning to save money to eventually buy their own land. Inside, he set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Julia Kellerman," he said. "I will love you every day for the rest of my life." "And I love you, Ethan Kellerman," Julia replied. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away. Thank you for calling me a blessing when everyone else called me a burden." "You were always a blessing," Ethan said. They were just too blind to see it. He kissed her again, and this time there was heat in it along with tenderness, promise along with passion. They came together as husband and wife, as partners who had chosen each other freely and completely. And Julia felt a wholeness she had never known existed. The months that followed were the happiest of Julia's life. She and Ethan built their life together with the same partnership they had shown from the beginning. Ethan continued his work at the ranch, earning a reputation as one of the best horsemen in the territory. Julia took in sewing and baking, supplying the boarding house and several other establishments in town, earning her own money and contributing equally to their household. They bought land, 5 acres with a small stream running through it and room to expand. They built a house together, Ethan doing the heavy work while Julia helped with the planning and the finishing touches. It was modest, but it was theirs, every board and nail a testament to their partnership. And then, 2 years after they were married, Julia woke one morning feeling strange. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with hard work, and certain smells made her feel queasy. Mrs. Fletcher took one look at her and smiled knowingly. "You are with child," she said with certainty. Julia felt fear and hope war within her chest. "How can you know?" "It is too early to be sure." "I have birthed 3 babies and raised 2, Mrs. Fletcher said. "I know the signs. You should see the doctor, but I would wager my boarding house that I am right." The doctor confirmed it a week later. Julia was indeed pregnant, about 2 months along if his examination was correct. She walked home in a daze, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach, her mind whirling. She was going to have a baby. After all these years, all the prayers and folk remedies and desperate hoping, she was finally pregnant. But the joy was complicated by fear. What if she lost the baby? What if something went wrong? What if the problem had always been with her, and she had simply been lucky this time? And beneath all of that was a deeper fear, an old wound that had never fully healed. What if having a child changed how Ethan saw her? What if his love had been contingent on her being the tragic, childless woman he had rescued, and motherhood transformed her into someone different, someone less interesting? She was sitting on the porch of their house, lost in these dark thoughts, when Ethan came home from work. He took one look at her face and was off his horse in an instant, kneeling in front of her with concern written across his features. "What is wrong?" he asked. "Are you ill? Did something happen?" Julia looked at him, at this man who had turned her entire life around with his kindness and respect, and decided that honesty was the only path forward. "I am pregnant," she said quietly. Ethan went very still. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and Julia felt her heart begin to crack, preparing for disappointment, for the revelation that she had been right to be afraid. And then Ethan's face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunrise. "You are pregnant," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Julia whispered. "But Ethan, I am frightened. What if something goes wrong? What if I lose the baby, or if something happens to me, or if—" Ethan gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Then we will face it together," he said, "just like we have faced everything else. But Julia, this is wonderful news. This is the most wonderful news." "You are not disappointed?" Julia asked, needing to hear it said clearly. "You said I was your greatest blessing even without children. Does that change now?" Ethan pulled back so he could look her in the eyes. "You are my greatest blessing," he said firmly. "That has not changed and will not change. This baby is an additional blessing, but you, Julia, you are the center of everything. You are my wife, my partner, my love. A child will add to our family, but you are my family. Do you understand?" Julia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Everyone in Fort Kearny said my only value was in bearing children. I know you are different, but I was afraid that maybe, deep down, you wanted that from me too." "I want you," Ethan said, "exactly as you are. And I am thrilled about the baby, but not because it makes you more valuable. You could not be more valuable to me than you already are." He laid his hand gently on her stomach. "But I am happy. I am so incredibly happy, Julia." Julia let herself believe him, let herself sink into the joy without reservation. They were going to have a baby. She and Ethan were going to be parents. It was terrifying and exhilarating and perfect. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Julia was sick for the first few months and exhausted for most of it. Ethan was attentive and patient, taking over more of the household chores, rubbing her feet when they swelled, and reading to her in the evenings when she was too tired to do anything but lie on the sofa. Mrs. Fletcher visited often, bringing advice and practical help, preparing Julia for what to expect in childbirth. The other women in Pine Ridge rallied around her as well, bringing baby clothes they had saved from their own children, offering tips and support. Julia felt embraced by a community in a way she had never been in Fort Kearny. Here, she was not judged for her past or measured by impossible standards. She was simply Julia, Ethan's wife, a valued member of the town, and soon to be a mother. When her time came in late October of 1875, the labor was long and difficult. Mrs. Fletcher stayed with her through all of it, coaching her through the pain, while Ethan paced outside like a caged animal, forbidden from the birthing room by propriety, but unable to go far from Julia's side. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the mountains, Julia gave birth to a son. He was small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that proclaimed his arrival with impressive volume. Mrs. Fletcher cleaned him and wrapped him in soft blankets, then placed him in Julia's arms. "You have a boy," she said with a warm smile, "and he is perfect." Julia looked down at the tiny face, the closed eyes, and the rosebud mouth and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. This was her son, hers and Ethan's, a child born of love and choice and partnership. Ethan was allowed in then, and he approached the bed with an expression of such awe and tenderness that Julia felt tears prick her eyes again. He looked at his son, reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek, and then looked at Julia with wonder written across his face. "You did it," he said softly. "Julia, you are amazing." "We did it," Julia corrected. "Together, like everything else." They named the boy Samuel after Ethan's father, with the middle name James after Julia's father, Samuel James Kellerman. He was a fussy baby, demanding and loud, and Julia loved him with a fierceness that surprised her. But she also found that motherhood did not complete her the way the women of Fort Kearney had insisted it would. It was wonderful and exhausting and terrifying, but it did not define her. She was still Julia, still the woman who loved horses and baking and long conversations on the porch with her husband. She had simply added another role to her life, not replaced everything that had come before. Ethan was a devoted father, taking to parenthood with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything else. He would walk Samuel around the house when the baby was fussy, singing cowboy songs in a surprisingly good voice. He changed diapers without complaint and took over the night feedings when Julia was too exhausted to function. "This is what partnership looks like," Julia told Mrs. Fletcher one day when the older woman had come to visit and found Ethan elbow-deep in laundry while Julia napped with the baby. Mrs. Fletcher smiled. "You chose well," she said. "Not every man would be so involved." "Not every man sees his wife as an equal," Julia said, "but Ethan always has. It is one of the many reasons I love him." The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Samuel grew from a fussy baby into a curious toddler, and then into a bright, energetic child. When he was 3, Julia discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she felt only joy, with no fear to complicate it. She had learned to trust in her body, in Ethan's love, and in their life together. Their second child was a daughter, born in the spring of 1879. They named her Rose, and she had Julia's light hair and Ethan's blue eyes. She was a calm baby, so different from Samuel that Julia and Ethan would joke that they proved children from the same parents could be completely different people. Samuel adored his little sister, hovering over her cradle and bringing her toys she was too young to appreciate. Ethan was just as devoted to his daughter as he was to his son, and Julia would often find him sitting in the rocking chair with Rose cradled against his chest, talking to her about the horses, or the weather, or whatever thoughts crossed his mind. "You are good at this," Julia told him one evening, watching him settle Rose for the night. "I have good inspiration," Ethan replied, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead before laying her gently in the cradle. He crossed to Julia and pulled her into his arms. "I love our family. I love this life we have built." "So do I," Julia said, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Sometimes I think about Fort Kearney, about the woman I was there, and it feels like a different lifetime." "It was a different lifetime," Ethan said. That Julia was drowning, suffocating under the weight of other people's expectations. This Julia is free. "Because of you," Julia said softly. "Because of us," Ethan corrected. "You had the courage to leave, to choose something different. I just gave you a reason to do it." Julia tilted her head back to look at him. "You gave me more than a reason. You gave me love and respect and a partnership I did not know existed. You gave me a family and a home and the freedom to be myself. You gave me everything, Ethan." "And you gave me the same," Ethan said, kissing her forehead. "I was drifting before you, searching for something I could not name. You are my home, Julia. You always have been." They stood there in the quiet of their children's room, holding each other as Rose made soft, sleeping sounds and Samuel dreamed in the next room. This was happiness, Julia thought. Not the grand, dramatic happiness of stories and songs, but the everyday happiness of partnership and love and family. Word eventually reached them from Nebraska. Mrs. Fletcher had connections in Fort Kearny, and through her, Julia learned that Thomas had remarried within a year of the divorce being finalized. His new wife had given him 3 children in rapid succession, and according to reports, he was no happier than he had been with Julia, still drinking, still bitter, still blaming everyone but himself for his disappointments. Julia felt no satisfaction in hearing it, only a deep sadness for the man he could have been, and the woman who was now enduring what she had endured. But she also felt profound gratitude that she had escaped, that she had found the courage to choose differently. She never returned to Fort Kearny. There was nothing there for her anymore. No family she wanted to see, no friends she wished to reconnect with. Her life was in Pine Ridge now, with Ethan and their children, with Mrs. Fletcher, and the community they had become part of. When Samuel was 8 and Rose was 5, Ethan and Julia finally had enough money saved to buy a larger piece of land and to build a proper ranch. They called it the Kellerman Ranch, and it became known throughout Wyoming for the quality of its horses. Ethan trained them with the same patience and skill he had shown with Thunder all those years ago, and Julia worked alongside him, her childhood knowledge returning as if it had never been buried under years of being told she was a failure. Samuel and Rose grew up learning to ride almost before they could walk, learning to care for animals and work the land. They grew up knowing they were loved unconditionally, that their worth was not measured by their accomplishments, but by who they were as people. They grew up seeing a partnership between their parents, a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection, and it shaped their understanding of what marriage and family could be. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Julia on a picnic to the spot where they had first camped on their flight from Nebraska. They had not been back in years, but Ethan had remembered the location, had wanted to return to mark the occasion. They sat by the creek that still murmured the same song it had sung a decade ago, eating food Julia had prepared and watching the sun track across the sky. Samuel and Rose were with Mrs. Fletcher for the day, giving their parents this rare time alone. "You ever regret it?" Ethan asked as they lay side by side on the blanket, his hand clasped in hers. "Leaving Fort Kearny, leaving everything you knew," Julia did not hesitate. "Not for a moment," she said. "Leaving was the best decision I ever made, the only decision that truly mattered. Even knowing how hard it has been. The scandal, the legal battles, the people who still judge you for divorcing, especially knowing that," Julia said. "Because all of that was worth it for this. For you, for our children, for our ranch. For a life where I am valued and loved and free to be myself." She turned on her side to look at him. "They called me a burden in Fort Kearny, Ethan. They measured my worth by my womb and found me lacking. But you called me your greatest blessing. You saw me when I could not see myself. You gave me a reason to fight for happiness, and I will never regret that." Ethan mirrored her position, his blue eyes intense and full of love. "You are my greatest blessing," he said. "Nothing has changed that, not time, not children, not the difficulties we have faced. You are the center of everything good in my life, Julia. You always will be." They kissed there by the creek, surrounded by the same wildflowers that had bloomed 10 years ago under the same vast Wyoming sky. And Julia felt a completion, a full-circle moment that brought tears to her eyes. "I am so grateful I helped that horse," she said when they finally pulled apart. If I had walked past the livery that day, I never would have met you. I think we would have found each other somehow, Ethan said. Some things are meant to be. Some people are meant to find each other. We were one of those inevitabilities. You believe in fate? Julia asked, surprised. Ethan had always been so practical, so grounded in the here and now. I believe in us, Ethan said simply. However we found each other, whatever forces brought us together, I am grateful for it. I am grateful for every day I get to spend with you. Julia snuggled closer, resting her head on his chest. I love you, Ethan Kellerman, more than I have words to express. And I love you, Julia Kellerman. My greatest blessing, today and always. They stayed there until the sun began to set, talking and laughing and simply being together. When they finally rode home as the stars were beginning to emerge, Julia felt a contentment so deep it seemed to radiate from her bones. Their life continued to unfold in moments of joy and challenge, the everyday rhythms of ranch work and child rearing, of community involvement and personal growth. Samuel grew into a responsible young man who had his father's way with horses and his mother's kind heart. Rose became a spirited young woman with a love of learning and a talent for healing, often helping the town doctor with his patients. When Samuel was 20 and Rose was 17, Mrs. Fletcher passed away peacefully in her sleep. Julia mourned her deeply, this woman who had taken a chance on two desperate people and had become like family. At the funeral, Julia spoke about Mrs. Fletcher's kindness, about how she had provided shelter and acceptance when the rest of the world seemed determined to judge and condemn. She taught me that family is not always about blood, Julia said, her voice thick with emotion. It is about who shows up for you, who sees you and values you and helps you become who you were meant to be. She was family to me, and I will carry her lessons for the rest of my life. In her will, Mrs. Fletcher left the boarding house to Julia and Ethan, along with a letter that made Julia cry for an hour after reading it. In the letter, Mrs. Fletcher wrote about how proud she was of Julia, how she had watched her transform from a frightened, beaten-down woman into someone confident and strong. She wrote about how Julia and Ethan had restored her faith in love, had shown her that good marriages existed even after she had watched her sister destroyed by a bad one. You were my blessing too, the letter concluded. Just as Ethan called you his. Never forget your worth, Julia. Never let anyone make you feel less than the extraordinary woman you are. Julia and Ethan decided to keep running the boarding house in Mrs. Fletcher's honor, hiring a manager to handle the day-to-day operations while they focused on the ranch. It became a place known for welcoming people in difficult circumstances, for providing refuge to those who needed a second chance. Julia made it her mission to help women in situations similar to what hers had been, offering them work and shelter, and the support to leave bad marriages if that was what they needed. Mrs. Fletcher would be proud, Ethan told Julia one evening as they watched a young woman with a black eye settle into one of the rooms, her two small children clinging to her skirts. I hope so, Julia said. I know what it feels like to believe you have no options, no way out. If I can give someone else the chance that you and Mrs. Fletcher gave me, then her legacy continues. The years turned into decades, and Julia and Ethan grew old together, their love deepening with time rather than fading. Their children married and had children of their own, filling the Kellerman ranch with the sound of grandchildren's laughter. Julia's hair went gray and Ethan's face lined with age, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had been that day in the livery stable, the cowboy and the woman who had helped a frightened horse and had found each other in the process. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Samuel gave a toast, his voice breaking with emotion as he spoke about his parents. Growing up, "I never understood how rare my parents' marriage was," he said. "I thought all parents loved each other the way mine did, with respect and partnership and genuine affection. It was not until I was older that I realized how special they are, how hard they fought to build this life and this family. Mom, Dad, you have given us the greatest gift possible. You have shown us what love looks like, and we are all better people for it." Rose spoke next, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, you have always been my hero," she said. "You taught me that a woman's worth is not measured by anyone else's standards, that we have the power to choose our own happiness. You showed me what strength looks like, what courage looks like. And Dad, you showed me what a good man looks like, what I should expect and demand from any partner. You set the bar so high that I almost did not think I would find someone who could meet it. But I did, and it is because you taught me not to settle for less than I deserve." Julia was crying openly by the time her children finished speaking, and Ethan's eyes were bright with unshed tears. They stood together in front of their family, surrounded by the life they had built, and Julia felt a sense of completion that was almost overwhelming. "I was not supposed to have this," she said when it was her turn to speak. "According to the people of Fort Kearney, I was supposed to be barren and worthless, a burden to my husband and a disappointment to everyone who knew me. But I found someone who saw me differently, who called me a blessing when everyone else called me a failure. And from that beginning we built all of this, a family, a home, a legacy of love and respect and partnership." She looked at Ethan, at the man who had transformed her entire world. "You were right, all those years ago, we were meant to find each other. And I am grateful for every single day we have had together." Ethan pulled her close, kissing her forehead in front of their entire family. "You are still my greatest blessing," he said, "today and always. Every single day I wake up next to you is a gift, Julia. I love you more now than I did 40 years ago, and I will love you more 40 years from now if we are lucky enough to have that time." The celebration lasted well into the night, the ranch house filled with music and laughter and the warmth of family. Julia moved through the rooms, speaking with her children and grandchildren, accepting their love and affection, and feeling deeply, profoundly grateful for the life she had been brave enough to choose. Late that night, after everyone had finally gone to bed and the house was quiet, Julia and Ethan sat on their porch, the same porch where they had spent countless evenings over the decades. The Wyoming night was clear and cool, the stars bright overhead, and Julia rested her head on Ethan's shoulder with a contentment that had only deepened with age. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked softly. "When we rode away from Fort Kearney all those years ago, did you imagine we would end up here?" "I imagined loving you," Ethan said. "I imagined building a life with you. The specifics did not matter as much as the certainty that we would be together. But this surpassed anything I could have dreamed, Julia. This family, this ranch, these 40 years, it has been more than I ever thought possible." "I was so frightened that day," Julia confessed, "when I packed my things and left Thomas. I was terrified that I was making a mistake, that I would regret it, that you would turn out to be just another version of him. But you were exactly who you appeared to be. You kept every promise you made, Ethan, every single one. Because you were worth keeping them for," Ethan said. "Because you were worth everything, worth the risk and the scandal and the hard years. You were worth it all, Julia." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands the way they had for 40 years, and Julia felt the story of her life settle into its final, perfect shape. She had been called a burden, had been judged and condemned and found wanting. But she had also been called a blessing by the one person whose opinion truly mattered. And from that belief, from that single act of seeing her worth, had grown a love story that had spanned decades and generations. a legacy of partnership and respect, and choosing each other every single day. As Julia drifted to sleep that night in the bed she had shared with Ethan for 40 years, surrounded by the quiet sounds of her family sleeping in rooms throughout the house, she thought about the girl she had been in Fort Kearney. That frightened, lonely girl who had believed the world when it told her she was worthless. She wished she could go back and tell that girl what was coming. Tell her that pain was not the end of the story, that happiness was waiting if she was brave enough to reach for it. But she could not go back, could only move forward. And as she slipped into sleep with Ethan's arm around her and the knowledge of her family's love surrounding her, Julia knew that moving forward had been exactly the right choice. She had been brave. She had reached for happiness. And she had found it in all its messy, beautiful, perfect reality. In the end, they were right about one thing in Fort Kearney. A woman's worth was measured by what she brought into the world, but they had been wrong about what that meant. It was not about children or social standing or meeting arbitrary standards. It was about love and courage and the choice to build a life worth living. And by that measure, Julia knew she was rich beyond counting. She was blessed beyond measure. And she was, and always would be, exactly enough.